Welcome back to The Urban Monk. Dr. Pedram Shojai here. Happy to be podcasting. It's one of my favorite things to do. I get to hang out and talk to smart people and share those conversations with you. My guest today, I met maybe 90 minutes during an interview a while back. Some hotel in LA, the way we hook up our interviews. He happened to be in town, and we had the pleasure of getting to meet him for the series Exhausted that's coming your way in a little while. Here's what I got to say about him. I meet a lot of doctors. I meet a lot of people. There's a lot of people out there flexing. There's a lot of people out there, getting their lines down so they could get famous and saying the things that, their people told them to say. Who you're about to meet today is actually just a smart man. He knew a lot about everything we talked about and was just prolific and very interesting. Great conversation, and I know he's going to bring it today because he's that guy. And plus, as I met him, he was off to go be on a boat for 3 months. So if he's not well rested by now, I don't know what's going to work. So, Dr. David Perlmutter, welcome to the Urban Monk.
I am totally delighted to see you and to be with you today.
Great to see you again, and welcome back. How long were you on that boat for? I know you said
actually,
you and your wife.
4 months. We left from Bellingham, Washington, and went to Provision in Vancouver, Canada. Worked our way through northern British Columbia, up the Inside Passage, all the way up to the glaciers in Alaska, and just my wife and me. Our kids each visited for about a week. And we had one couple that came for about 4 days, but the rest of the time, my wife and me. And it was an amazing experience in terms of solitude, in terms of disconnection from, the fast pace of our modern world that we're all deeply engaged in, and having to figure things out each day and run a boat. It was breathtaking.
Were you fishing daily? I mean, is that where your food came
from? Sometimes we'd have to make some tracks, so we didn't fish on those days, but pretty much we did fish most of the time, or crab or prawn. And I would say that I'm very grateful I put an extra freezer on the boat, because when we finally finished our trip at the end of the summer, that freezer was totally full, and we were able just to pack all that stuff into an insulated box and carried it home on the, as checked luggage on the airplane. So we actually are still having halibut and salmon from the summer. Who knew?
Oh, man. Well, what a perfect segue into today's subject, because your brain's got a lot of good fat from a nice fishing expedition, and you brought some home. So we're talking about quiet. We're talking about solitude. We're talking about disconnecting. We're talking about good fish oil, and all sorts of other things that probably made your brain feel all right after a 4-month expedition.
Yeah, feeling all right, not feeling too good myself. Yeah.
That's it. So, I mean, look, you're an expert on the brain. There is so much to be said on this subject. We are just so wired and tired and frustrated and feeling like, our lives aren't coming together. And a lot of that, I mean, we can talk about the distinction between mind and brain and what that is to you. A lot of that comes from the brain and how we are feeding that sucker and how we are letting it relax and reset and detox and do all the things it needs to do so that we could actually think clearly. So before we jump into the kind of the big overall subject, just a little history on how you got into this mess. I think you were still rounding in a hospital when I met you, last year or earlier this year or whatever. I mean, you're still actively engaged in medicine. So just give us a little bit about you.
Sure. Well, I've been actively engaged in neurosciences since I was about, I wrote my first paper at 19 and gave my first lecture at 20 to the American Heart Association Stroke Council in Dallas, Texas. I remember it was middle of winter and I wore a light blue suit and everybody was kind of wondering what that was all about. But at that point, my research really focused on neuroanatomy and specifically microsurgical anatomy. How can we define the anatomy of the brain such that now that we were introducing the microscope into neurosurgery, neurosurgeons could have a roadmap. And then I, of course, went to medical school, did my residency, and went out into the field and practiced mainstream neurology, which was very frustrating for me for 10 years. And then finally left that practice and opened up my own clinic so I could begin to both explore and then implement leading edge ideas that were started to be published that related, for example, lifestyle choices and how lifestyle choices could be leveraged in terms of both treating existing illness and certainly preventing neurodegenerative conditions down the line. And in those days, and unfortunately to a certain extent these days, the idea that our lifestyle choices are influential in terms of our brain's destiny still remains an idea that is not well embraced by mainstream medicine. And I say that because just 2 weeks ago I lectured to a very large group of mainstream practitioners, and I'm very grateful to have had that opportunity. It was certainly enlightening for me to recognize how much more work there is to do in terms of getting the message out that, the same parameters that influence cardiovascular risk, diabetes, cancer, are operative as it relates to the degeneration of the brain. So, these fundamentals that we all kind of live and breathe in our world, inflammation, free radical mediated stress, etc., and all the channels that lead into that, are absolutely front and center as it relates to the brain. Brain's not apart from the rest of the body. I think you were alluding earlier to a distinction between brain and mind. Well, if we stay on the brain for just a moment, it is part of the whole. Despite what Descartes wanted us to believe in terms of, isolated body parts, we know that the brain functions integrally. And when I say that in terms of its integration with the rest of the body, what affects part of the body affects the whole. Like Chief Seattle said, man did not weave the web of life, he's merely a strand of it. And so it is with the human body that, we have a book coming out tomorrow, a professional book called The Microbiome in the Brain. And when I say we have a book coming out, I'm the editor-in-chief. I didn't actually write a chapter, though I wrote the introduction. But it relates, and I go through this bizarre relationship that we've had with microbes dating back to Semmelweis and washing your hands before you deliver a baby. This relationship, that idea that all microbes are germs in the derogatory sense and therefore should be castigated, to the world that we now live in that embraces this notion that we have this symbiotic relationship with most of our gut organisms, for example, whose activities are salubrious towards us, wanting to keep us alive. And that's been a long time coming to embrace that. So these are the kind of ideas that began to nurture my practice techniques to allow me to feel comfortable with pushing the envelope and integrate ideas into a neurology practice. With you and me talking about right now the idea that neurology has been kind of the last entry at the party in terms of being able to embrace these alternative methods. We've known for years that, cardiovascular health could be improved if we exercise, and that bone density is better with weight bearing in women. All those things are kind of well entrenched and accepted. But the idea that physical exercise, for example, might benefit a person's brain function and might help that individual be resistant to Alzheimer's disease, boy, that was a long time coming. And, for the most part, there's still a deep entrenchment into the old ways of the brain being looked upon as being isolated. And it's such a disservice for, the population at large. There was a study that came out in December of 2017, published by the journal Neurology, one of our most well-respected journals, and it was practice recommendations for practicing neurologists for what you should do when you are confronted with a patient who has what's called mild cognitive impairment, which we now recognize is a pretty reliable harbinger to future Alzheimer's. I mean, generally, if you're diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, I wouldn't say the die is cast, but pretty much that there's things on the horizon. The storm clouds are starting to accumulate. And they went through a whole list of 14 different interventions, including donepezil, memantine, various drugs that are common these days. And they only made one conclusion based upon available science. And that was that the only recommendation that I, as a practicing neurologist, could make with scientific support is to tell that patient to take a supplement called exercise. That was the thing that the American Academy of Neurology recommended. Now, I mean, I'm sitting down right now, but I would have to sit down after making that statement to you because, number one, there was no drug that has been validated. Number two, they recommended a lifestyle intervention, which is what they said all neurologists, standard of care in America, should be providing to their patients as a recommendation to help delay the onset of full-blown Alzheimer's to those who've already qualified for mild cognitive impairment. And pretty amazing. And yet, that's not what's happening. Here it comes from the powers that be, and yet mainstream neurology doesn't embrace that, despite the sanction that it has gotten. So that's the practice that I developed over the ensuing 25 years, and I really enjoyed it. I actually stopped clinical medicine at this point, and now am dedicating my time to public outreach. We've just completed a docu-series on Alzheimer's prevention, oddly enough, with a really in-depth review of diet, sleep, meditation, certainly exercise, and various other modalities that have a huge impact on the destiny of the brain by me interviewing people from around the country. And it's time to offer up another way of looking at this problem, a big problem in America affecting 5.8 million of us, for whom it's pretty much a one-way street. It's pretty much a die being cast. And the economic impact is $250 billion in America right now for a disease that may well be preventable. So even the economic impact, if you don't want to embrace the notion that this is an emotional impact for families, loved ones, and caregivers, okay, let's look at the economic impact. So I actually presented all this information to the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, Washington, D.C., and said, aside from what it does to people in terms of their families, aside from what it did to me, holding my father as he died from Alzheimer's disease in my arms, what that event was for me, so I get it. What is the economic impact? We talk about prevention of issues around the world. It's not infectious diseases that rank number one. It's not trauma. It's not war. It is the chronic inflammatory degenerative conditions, including Alzheimer's, which may well rank number three as cause of death on the planet today. But other things, diabetes, coronary artery disease, cancer, which are significantly affected by the lifestyle choices that we make. So, that's been the motivation, and that remains the motivation now in moving forward. What we identified mechanistically was that inflammation is playing this pivotal role. Not to fully castigate inflammation, we recognize, perhaps at another time we'll discuss the upsides of inflammation, an important process in the body. But it's the chronic amplification of inflammation through an incredible number of pathways that seems to underlie the genesis of this cellular degeneration that plays such a role in chronic degenerative conditions. Now we are moving forward and recognizing that this same inflammation that underpins Alzheimer's, for example, underpins rewiring of the brain. And this is where I hope our conversation goes today, because it's been a revelation for both me and Austin Perlmutter, MD, our son, who was the co-author of our new book. The idea that inflammation is rewiring our brains and hence locking us more into functioning from more primitive brain centers like the amygdala, and at the same time disconnecting us from the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain that allows us to consider the future consequences of our choices today, that allows us to be more compassionate and allows us to participate in something called empathy. What we identified is that inflammation is a cornerstone mechanism, and beyond that, another dot to connect is that diet, through its huge influence on levels of inflammatory mediators in the body, is playing a huge role. That the Western diet, being so pro-inflammatory, now spreading to all corners of the globe, is at the same time spreading inflammation and therefore changing the wiring of the global population towards a less empathetic, more us versus them mentality. Therefore, this dietary shift on the planet has existential implications. So I think that's the short answer to your question, but I've had a couple of cups of coffee and have been thinking about our interview today. So there you go.
Awesome. No, there's a lot there to unpack. I'll go back and just hit on a couple points that I just don't want to drop before we jump into the existential implications for our society, because I love where you're going. One, neurologists typically are considered one of the highest depression and suicide rates in medicine, because they're really good at diagnosing and saying, turns out after all this, careful analysis and super science, my paper here says you're screwed, right? And the implication that the journal landed on exercise as the number one intervention preventative measure versus some sort of complicated super science, that's an uncomfortable place for a lot of doctors to go. It's like, look, I went full circle for 40 years of my career to tell you that you should go work out. You came to me, it's like, Hispanic patients come in, they need a shot, right? Because they need the doctor to do something. I think people tend to trivialize some of this lifestyle advice because it's like, come on, I came to you for something really smart, and I came to you for some big words, right? And now here we are full circle saying you need to exercise, you need to eat better, and the fate of the world depends on it. Like it's just such an interesting inflection point, not just for the profession, which is trying to find itself in all of this because it's used to trying to sound smart and come up with big interventions, or there's some machine or some device that's supposed to fix this, not push-ups. And so all that has gotten you to where you're at, and it's pulled you out of clinical science into being a voice and writing books and getting out there and talking about this stuff, which is absolutely, to me, the most important part. The root of the word doctor, docer, is to teach. And
That's
here
right.
you are. And here you are. Now you're carrying this message and carrying it out to the people. So first question, let's go back to the gut microbiome and the vagus nerve, and what we know about how this gut dysbiosis is jumping up node by node and getting to the brain. We could prevent and predict all kinds of things based on what we're seeing in the gut, and it's revolutionizing everything, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, in the most broad sense, I think that we certainly recognize that the gut and the goings-on in the gut play a very important role in regulating this process of inflammation through a number of mechanisms, through direct metabolic products, and also through the maintenance efforts of our gut bacteria as it relates to gut permeability, going through the notion that increased permeability allows the transgression of things like lipopolysaccharide, which then induces upregulation of inflammatory mediators. And, that's an important role of gut bacteria. So, I think we can go through a lot of these, but just that, and perhaps also we should certainly touch upon the idea that the diversity and functionality of our gut bacteria are recognized now as playing important roles in metabolism. That there are profound changes that are associated, for example, with type 2 diabetes, to the extent that there's been some success in actually treating type 2 diabetes with people who've undergone fecal microbial transplant. But vis-a-vis our discussion, we recognize that even subtle elevations of blood sugar, getting back to the gut and its role in regulating same, even subtle elevations of blood sugar, as described in 2014 in the New England Journal of Medicine, September, are associated with increased risk of becoming demented. So this is an interesting study that followed folks for, I believe it was 6.7 years, about 3,000 individuals, and the only test they did on the front end was a simple fasting blood sugar. That's it. go about your life, come what may, come back in 5 years, 7 years, whatever. We're going to reassess you cognitively and see if we can draw some correlations. And what was demonstrated was that, even a blood sugar of 105 now begins to be associated with increased risk for a situation for which there is no treatment, and that is dementia. At least no treatment offered up in mainstream medicine. So when we see correlations, for example, between hemoglobin A1C and rate of brain atrophy, as well as these studies that look at correlation of fasting blood sugar to downstream issues with respect to cognition, it can point back to gut bacteria. We understand that dramatic changes happen to the gut bacteria in terms of their diversity. And when I say diversity, I mean resilience. So correlation of diversity to resilience with even things like artificial sweeteners. What a fraud to perpetrate on the global population that, yes, we've now learned that sugar is bad, therefore use sucralose or saccharin. I mean, studies from Israel, for example, and France have demonstrated that there's a significant increased risk of weight gain, as well as significant increased risk for developing type 2 diabetes in those individuals who consume these artificial sweeteners. And yet, hey, I'm drinking this diet drink because it doesn't have sugar. That type of stuff, I do my very best to bring that out. I'm going to pass that information on to you. Now we come upon the challenge, and that is, what do you do with that information as a consumer? And that gets to making choices, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But so we understand then that the gut bacteria, the microbiome, we call it, when we consider both, the metabolites as well as the genetic material as well as the actual organisms themselves, their important role in regulating things like insulin sensitivity, blood sugar, blood-brain barrier permeability, the production of excitatory neurotransmitters, their production of important short-chain fatty acids, meaning how, when we extrapolate what the short-chain fatty acids do in terms of gene expression. So, wow, what a concept that our gut bacteria are playing a role in regulating our genome. This legacy that we've gotten from mom and dad and all who have come before are interacting. It's a bidirectional communication, are interacting with our gut bacteria. And this relationship has been ongoing for 1 million years. Suddenly, we dramatically shift one side of this equation by altering our gut bacteria, or we dramatically shift the other side of the equation, the output from the brain that can affect the gut bacteria. How do we do that? One powerful way we can do that is by increasing cortisol levels, both acutely and in terms of long term, by being engaged in things like chronic stress, not getting restorative sleep, and even depriving ourselves of exposure to nature. All of these things increase cortisol. And that's the other side of the coin that we need to consider. Increasing cortisol, or cortisol over a long period of time, changes the diversity, increases permeability, and as such creates this feedback loop whereby increased levels of inflammation then ultimately lead to increased problems that then can increase cortisol. By that I mean, when we increase inflammation, it compromises our ability, as I mentioned earlier, to make good choices. We become more impulsive, and that has to do with our lifestyle choices, our food choices, for example. Food that has higher caloric density, less nutritional density, and as such we gain weight. When we gain weight, that increases the production of inflammatory mediators, and in addition will cause us to experience less restorative sleep. Less restorative sleep increases inflammation, increases cortisol, and these are very dangerous self-propagating feedback loops that ultimately go to a place that we don't want to go to. And so what we want to focus on is how do we break those loops to allow people to finally regain control, as we've described many times, how we can bring the adult back into the room. So lots of ways that, we've been exploring this relationship of the gut bacteria to the brain. We know that they are involved in what is called amyloidogenesis, the genesis of amyloid protein, the production of TMAO, trimethylamine oxide, that has been related to things like cardiovascular disease and does have some brain implications as well, the metabolism of choline and carnitine to TMAO. So lots of things that we consider then in terms of this bidirectional, very important that we stress that, relationship. You had mentioned the vagus nerve. I mean, that's one channel by which there is direct moment-to-moment influence of the gut from the brain. And now, how exciting it is to learn that this cuts both ways. That it may well be, for example, that this alpha-synuclein misfolded protein that characterizes Parkinson's disease may actually make its way to the brain through the vagus nerve, the superhighway, the vagus, the vagabond, as it were, and as such relate the gut and the brain. For so many years in seeing Parkinson's patients, so many gut complaints. And we thought, oh, that's interesting, but can't have any relevance. Yeah, like we did with autism. Oh, well, that's interesting, but no relevance there. Look, as it relates to autism, how this relationship between changes in diversity and various species and, more importantly, the metabolic products of the gut bacteria are now being looked upon as having a primary role to play in the neurological manifestations of that situation.
It's amazing. It really, truly is.
Real quick, a study done by University of Arizona, collaborative study with Harvard, doing fecal microbial transplant on 20 autistic children, showing significant improvements both in their gastrointestinal issues as well as some neurologic problems as well. So that relationship is so profound, and from my perspective, what an amazing opportunity that our playing field has been so widened, that we have all these new tools in the toolbox that look at diet, that look at exercise. We know that there's an increased diversity of gut bacteria in people who engage in exercise. That study actually looked at cardiorespiratory function and correlated higher cardiorespiratory function as a manifestation of exercise with higher levels of gut diversity, bacterial diversity. So we know that there are changes associated with sleep, and it goes without saying, and now I'll say it. Why do people say it goes without saying and then they say it? But it goes with saying that certainly diet is front and center. So the role of diet in brain health is just beginning to take off, and I'm thrilled just to be sort of in touch with this information.
Yep. I want to talk about the elephant in the room, because this to me is, this is the bitch of it all. And it's this funny thing, these negative feedback loops and this self-fulfilling prophecy that doesn't need to be. We're talking about higher moral reasoning and empathy, prefrontal cortex. We're talking about negation of impulses, saying no to the cheesecake, saying no to the couch and the TV and getting out on the treadmill or going for a hike and doing all the things that we know will fix it are also part of the problem. So when we are eating a certain way, not exercising and doing the things that, like consuming sugars that are feeding the bad microbes, we are diminishing our brain's ability to power the part of the brain that allows for us to make the better lifestyle choices, right? So how do we pierce this? Because so many people listening right now are like, man, I tried exercising. I tried the damn New Year's resolutions. It's so hard to say no to the cheesecake. How do I get in, Doc? Like, how do I get a foot in the door to at least stand a chance?
Let me first say, this is something I probably should save to the end, but I'm going to say it right now. Thanks for having me, by the way, because I'm really enjoying the line of questioning, and I don't know how many people will listen to this, but it's great to have this conversation with you. But
awesome. Thanks
it's
for
good
being
to
here.
say things when you want to say them. And anyway, there's a line out of a Joni Mitchell song. It says, tears and fears and feeling proud to say I love you right out loud, you know? And we need to say things. But anyway.
Well, thank you, and it's an honor to have you.
Yeah, I'm having a good time here. I think you raise a very important point. And I believe that it doesn't matter where you choose to jump on the carousel, that if there's anything you can do to reconnect to the prefrontal cortex, that will then make the next decision slightly or significantly easier. So you identify where you believe is your biggest challenge, whether it's you've got an Oura ring and you realize you're not sleeping well, or your wife or husband tells you, hey, you stop breathing at night, or you know darn well that you don't exercise like you should, or it's pretty clear you're not eating well, or you're not spending any time out of doors, or you really have sort of given up on connecting with other people, or you are, like most Americans, spending an awful lot of time in front of one screen or another. The average American spends more than 6 hours a day in front of a screen, which, you know, you take that out over a lifetime, that's 22 years of screen time. And we can discuss the implications of that, but certainly one implication is when you're doing one thing, you're not doing something else. You're not doing the other things that I just talked about. So we're all in for even one or two ideas to get the ball rolling. And whether it's paying attention to your sleep, and that might mean going and having a polysomnogram and seeing what the sleep specialist tells you, whether you have sleep apnea, what is your amount of time spent in deep sleep. Are you activating your lymphatic system and helping purge your brain of metabolic waste? What is your sleep latency? What is your heart rate variability during sleep? All these things I think are really important. How much REM time are you getting? I think it's a lot easier to determine how much time you're spending exercising. And 95% of American adults do not get 30 minutes of exercise a day, despite the recommendations to the contrary. Like we talked about earlier, in terms of being able to reduce the progression of MCI to Alzheimer's. Well, how about reducing the risk from normality into MCI, or from normality into cardiovascular disease, or from normality into a state of higher inflammation and higher cortisol? All of those things are benefited by exercise. They're also benefited by nature exposure. And 87% of Americans' time is spent indoors, and 6% more is spent in a car. It doesn't leave much time for reconnecting with nature and experiencing the benefits of that activity. And people will say, oh, I don't live near a park, or I can't go to Yellowstone this weekend. Exposure to nature could mean putting a houseplant in your kitchen, or taking it to work, or even a photograph of a natural environment changes moment to moment the way that your brain is operating. There's, if I may digress for just a moment, an interesting study took a group of 30 individuals, and it challenged them while they were undergoing a functional MRI scan with various types of pictures of environments, and demonstrated that looking at a scene of nature versus an urban environment lit up the amygdala. We can call it perhaps the fear center, in different ways. We know that decision making after just looking at a picture of nature versus looking at an urban environment is altered, to the extent that a more impulsive decision making to a significant degree is fostered by looking at that urban environment. And how this is what's called delayed discounting, where they give people the idea that, look, you can get $10 today or $100 today. What do you choose? Well, I'll choose the $100. Okay, how about a week from now? You can get $10 or $100. Pretty much everybody says, I can wait a week. But when we pull that out to a year, 2 years, 5 years, what would you do at that period of time? Just showing people pictures of the urban environment locks them into that impulsive $10 decision, whereas the people who simply looked at pictures of nature we're locked into a better decision-making paradigm, activating the prefrontal cortex and making a decision that considered long-term consequences. So, this is what we're looking at now. I mean, it's breathtaking, isn't it?
It's staggering to think about the decisions that people are making in their day-to-day life. And under duress, just too many rats in a cage, under duress, and what that does to the rest of their timeline based on the moment in time, the inflection point of just the level of stress that was there. Walk in nature, sitting and meditate, just these things that we know will ultimately change the trajectory of your entire life if you did them. And they're so simple, they're just missing.
I really, really hope to get through to your listeners that this is so darn important, that our decision-making ability has been hacked. We don't suffer these days from lack of information, right? Everybody's bought all the books. Everybody's seen the public television programs, listened to the podcast. We know generally what makes for good food choices. We know that we should exercise. We know that sleep is important, although not as many people value that. And the issue is not really so much getting the information, or in your case, giving out the information. It is action. And what we've addressed in our new book, Brainwash, is providing the bridge then between information and action. I mean, how many people make these New Year's resolutions and this is what I'm going to do, and yet next year it's time to make the same resolution all over again. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but there are active attempts out there to hack into our decision-making ability. And these hack into, some of our survival instincts. Like one survival instinct that we all carry is our desire for sweet. And let me walk through that, because very quickly people are saying, well, how could that be a survival instinct? Well, sweet in our hunter-gatherer days provided our forebears information that particular fruit was ripe, had its highest level of nutritive content. Not that they were thinking that, but they just catered to their sweet tooth. But interestingly, when fruit tends to ripen, at least wild fruit, it's kind of late in the summer, early in the fall, and suddenly we're getting a sugar blast that's turning on our production of insulin, which does what? Allows us to make and store body fat. So guess what? Those people who had that adaptation gene, the sweet tooth, survived because we lay down a layer of fat, and then we were able to survive during times of caloric scarcity. So that is an entry point then for production of, call it food if you will, that of the 1.2 million foods sold in America's grocery stores, over 60% have added sweetener. Why? Again, to hack into that. When we consume foods higher in sugar, it changes our gut bacteria, it changes our metabolism. Ultimately, that leads to blood sugar going up, increased body fat, and we're back to where we started, higher levels of inflammation. That again hack into our ability to make these good choices, so we're going to continue to eat those foods. Another interesting entrance point is man is a social animal. We survived ostensibly not because we were loners, but because we were better off working in groups and had division of labor, and we could cover each other's backs and look out for each other. Well, now this desire has been hacked into by what is called social media. And unfortunately, we recognize that those relationships on social media are not doing what the in-person eye contact, olfactory stimulation, microbe sharing relationships do to a human being. So in many ways, social media is anything but yet we recognize that despite social media and despite the number of rats in the cage, to use your metaphor from earlier, we are lonelier than ever. 42% of Americans report significant feelings of loneliness, and less than 50% indicate that they have any meaningful in-person relationship contact on a daily basis. So that's a disservice to us. We need each other. When we foster to an amygdala-based behavior set, it tends to foster with other brain anatomical regions as well. But maybe more importantly, when we disconnect from the prefrontal cortex, it tends to foster an us versus them mentality. And we can't continue that. It's not going to allow us to survive. If it's us versus them, we disregard our neighbors, we disregard our communities, we disregard our planet, and moving forward, that's not sustainable. So that is this existential consideration with respect to what we call disconnection syndrome. So we are disconnecting from the prefrontal cortex. And we take disconnection syndrome a lot further, disconnecting from each other, disconnecting from the messaging of our genome, shutting off gene expression that has kept us able to survive, while amplifying genes that were probably fairly dormant in the past, but are now, are just wide open and increasing inflammatory mediator production while shutting off antioxidant production, compromising glutathione S-transferase, our ability to deal with toxins, for example. We need to amplify those gene pathways by regaining our connection to this powerful epigenetics that we are blessed with. Jump right in by eating cruciferous vegetables, for example, and reducing our consumption of refined foods. So, that cruciferous vegetable pathway through the activation of what we call the NRF2 pathway, hugely powerful to allow us so many good things to happen, and not the least of which is reducing inflammation, allowing us to connect to that part of the brain that defines us as human beings.
If I may, there's another logical extension to what you're saying as the life and the will to live and the ability to function from higher cognitive centers is diminished. And we'll talk about this in a second. It also extends to global pollution. It also extends to pesticide use. It also extends to the extinguishing of life all around us, because the part of us that makes us feel alive, that helps us understand who we are in this web of life, is being cast down upon by this dark cloud of unconscious behavior that we feel like we're out of control of. And so look, for every one David Perlmutter, there's about 100 neurologists that are consulting with companies that want to know exactly how the amygdala works to sell you their shit, right? Industry is using neurology because we don't stand a chance. The circuitry that drives our survival, I mean, man, that is hardwired in for so many millennia. And we have been exploited to consume sugars, to think I need a Toyota truck because I need to be a man. I need to buy this survival gear because they're coming to get me. All this messaging. None of this is arbitrary. There's a lot of science that's gone into this, and there's been a lot of science for sale. And so if you don't understand how to get yourself out of the trap, if you can't spring the trap and eat some broccoli and wake up to the higher centers of your brain, you're being manipulated by the lower centers, by the marketing messaging that makes you feel inadequate, that makes you feel like you need to do this thing to survive. I need the $10 right now because the world is collapsing in around me. You can't make long-term decisions that will be better for you and your family. And I mean, this is an existential dilemma, but it starts with every choice you make, right? No one is putting the cheesecake in your mouth.
I think people have no idea the extent to which the science is involved here in your brain manipulation. You can, for your product that you want to bring to market, and you're trying to figure out which advertisement, what angle is going to be best. It used to be, you did what was called a focus group, and you asked for their opinions after, should we use this color? What about this music? And how do we target people? Now it's functional MRI. And it's recognition of how you can light up those areas of the brain that are involved in impulsivity and making quick decisions. and reward circuits being activated based on the messaging around your product that might be, a lamp or a chair or who knows what, but yet that's the level of manipulation of people's brains. It is Orwellian as can be and concerning as can be. And I would say that job one that we wanted to tackle in Brainwash is calling it out. Because I think being aware that this is happening right off the bat is huge. And because most people don't know, it's operating in the background, but it is pervasive and it is effective and it is growing in its utilization. That you can have access to functional MRI now. If you want to sell a product, there are companies that'll say, we'll get a group of people, we'll do fMRI, and we'll present them with various challenges and see what works. Yowza, that's scary business. But, as Christian Lang, Nobel Prize winner, said in 1921, that technology is a useful servant, but a dangerous master. And I want to be clear that I am not, and we are not, Austin and I, are not anti-technology. I mean, we wrote this book based upon access to an unlimited repository of information, the internet. But, we recognize this degree of manipulation that's happening to us with our online experiences that, are captivating for people. Let me read a quote from Tristan Harris, who was what was called a Google design ethicist. He said, once you know how to push people's buttons, you can play them like a piano. I don't want to be played like a piano, but I think knowing that stuff's going on in the background is job one. And then later what we describe in Brainwash is, okay, what do you do about it? And one of the things we developed is the test of time, and time being an acronym for T, time. How much time are you willing to dedicate to what it is you're attempting to accomplish on your online experiences? Is it answering the email? Is it looking up a pathway of metabolism, or trying to figure out what type of paint you're going to paint your walls? Whatever it may be, how much time you're going to allocate to that? Is it intentional? Is your online experience intentional? Are you focused on that goal, or are you suddenly being distracted by clickbait down a rabbit hole into oblivion, and suddenly 2 hours go by? Is it a mindful experience? While you're engaged in your online experience, are you aware of what's going on? Do you remain mindful? And finally, is that experience enriching? Is it a positive experience when you're done with what you attempted to do online? Are you net positive? Or did you get distracted and ended up buying crap online that you didn't need because that made you momentarily feel better, and and you were, ads popped up to tell you that you weren't good enough, you weren't thin enough, rich enough, pretty enough, whatever it may be, and there was suddenly further advertising for a way to fix that problem. Were you captivated by that? So we call it the test of time. And again, we're not Luddites, we're not anti-tech. I love tech. Look what you and I are doing right now.
We're on tech right now.
If it weren't for technology. But again, it's a useful servant, but a dangerous master. And I think we have to take a step back and say, whoa, 6 hours a day, the average American, in the adolescent, excessive time showing magnetic resonance imaging changes in the brain, including less connection through the corpus callosum of the right and left hemispheres. Yowza. I mean, again, it doesn't have to be this way. And we start a conversation with looking at those entrance points. Okay, let's talk about your sleep, for example. Let's if you don't exercise, let's say 5 minutes a day. Anybody can commit to that. If you don't live out in nature, maybe there's a park nearby. One recent study showed that people who are urban dwellers who got out to the park, when you measure their salivary cortisol levels, had a dramatic reduction immediately in their stress hormone just by getting to the park and have maybe you go there and meet somebody, maybe you have your lunch there each day from work, or even if you can't get out, you put a plant, as I mentioned earlier, in your home. it's been demonstrated that even having plants in a hospital waiting room is associated with a pretty dramatic reduction in stress as measured by various parameters, including cortisol levels. So it doesn't matter where you want to jump on. It's the most important part about reaching your goal is getting started. And as soon as you gain just a foothold in regaining your ability to make good decisions, that will then be a feed-forward process, we hope, that allows you to make better and better decisions moving forward.
Let's talk about particularly. We're running out of time here, but I definitely want to cover this last subject here. It's something near and dear to my heart. Helped me a lot in my life. Is this thing called meditation, these mind-body practices. There's studies out there that show NF-kappa B, just reduction of major inflammatory pathways and genetic expression just by learning how to chill out. And everyone I talk to is like, well, I don't know. I tried meditating. It didn't work. It's like I said, I tried downhill snow skiing once and it didn't work. You got to practice it, right? And once you practice it, you get better at it, and then the rewards are there. There are things out there like walking out in nature, putting a plant in there, meditating, doing mind-body practices that have tremendous value in jumping in and hacking into this circuitry that's kind of in a downward spiral and stopping you. And in my clinical practice, and I've been out of practice for about 4 or 5 years now, the patients that would take on a mind-body practice were the ones that had unbelievable results, and the ones that just kind of stayed in their humdrum and did a couple recommendations, but just wanted to insist on living the life as they were living it, they did okay, right? So let's talk about this type of intervention. I don't care what mind-body practice it is, whether you're doing yoga or praying or whatever. What do we know about it, Doc?
Well, first, that last sentence was very enlightening. That there are a lot of practices out there, and there's pretty much uniformity in terms of what they do with respect to the brain. Andrew Newberg has done some terrific research demonstrating on pretty sophisticated brain imaging that there is lighting up of the prefrontal cortex. That's what we want. There's lighting up of the part of the brain that lets us be compassionate and empathetic and allows us to make decisions based upon conceiving how they may play out in the future for ourselves and for others. So it really, those are some pretty compelling studies. And at the same time, what we know is that these practices distance us from relying on the amygdala, an area of the brain that really is involved in impulsivity and making decisions, without consideration of their future consequence. So, that's what the research shows, in addition to, as you mentioned, its role in looking at things like NF-kappa B activation, measurements of inflammatory markers, measurements of cortisol. It may take as little as 12 minutes a day, and as mentioned, it may not really be that fundamental what that type of practice is, but the long-term benefits are vast. When we look at actual studies that are able to determine not just that the amygdala has been calmed down, but the degree that it's been calmed down by mindfulness practices, they're pretty dramatic. And it might not be that people are going to necessarily have a strong feedback to recognize that things are happening. It's not like going on a diet and losing 10 pounds. Hey, I can go to the next belt loop or whatever it may be. There is some faith that people have to have that this is really powerful stuff, and it is. So, it's extremely convincing science, and I think that the more people hear about this, the more we'll embrace it. But you are correct that it is, you brought up downhill skiing, and you are apparently a pretty good skier from what I understand, and that didn't come to you overnight. It's not like you went out there and the next day there you were. What the Dalai Lama told us is the brain we develop reflects the life we lead. And to be more scientific about that, Dalai Lama has done some incredible research into neurosciences, and specifically neurogenesis, and most importantly into this notion of neuroplasticity. But it plays upon this notion of neuroplasticity, that neurons that fire together ultimately wire together as you developed your snow skiing skills, you did that because you kept activating those pathways. That's the same process that's involved in meditation. Ultimately, though it transiently connects us to the prefrontal cortex, that ultimately becomes much more indelible. So we can live that more enlightened life and actually be more compassionate beings by engaging in this practice of meditation. We're going to amplify that pathway. And another quote from the Dalai Lama is, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. So by practicing acts of compassion, and I'm going to add to that gratitude, we amplify even during our non-meditative times, we amplify this connection to this prefrontal cortex that allows us to take a step back and not be locked into instantaneous response of responding to people tweeting immediately that somebody said something, I'm going to tweet back. And you've been involved in martial arts, and let me give you an interesting metaphor here, because perhaps others of your listeners can relate to this. It's really the difference between block and counterpunch that those of us who studied martial arts would practice hours on end, blocking the incoming strike and then counterpunching, right? To deflecting and moving on. And that is a conscious appreciation of what's going on and realizing that there's really no sense in engagement and moving on. We've all had these experiences where we're caught up in traffic, or somebody says something to us, or we get a one on a review of a book we've written, for example, and it's totally off base. But it's really getting to a place of being okay with that's how the world is. My mission here is to see it in the best possible light I possibly can, and then try to make it better. So I'm hoping that metaphor resonates with some of your listeners, but I really think it's something that if we can all embrace for just a moment, I think it'll have some positive outcome.
Amen. Amen. There's so much to be said for the way we're living our lives and the reflection of the world around us. If you're complaining about the world around you, look within, start to find the resilience, start to find the inner Aikido, and block and parry, and eventually just not even have those situations unfold as you get better at it, right? I mean, I'm just more sane when I meditate. I'm going to go downhill skiing as soon as we're off this interview. Like I moved up to Deer Valley because that's my drug of choice. I love doing these things and they help me make better decisions. So if you're finding yourself making not so great decisions, if you're finding yourself having a hard time stepping in and doing what you know is better for you, you got to fix your brain. And we've talked about a lot of it here. Look, your new book is amazing. I highly recommend, it's called Brainwash. I highly recommend anyone who's listening to this, go get the book right now, read the book, and then just do one thing in it, right? If you're looking for the time to meditate, just look at your screen time and take away 25%, and there's your meditation, there's your nature time. There's so much time wasted, and there's so many wonderful things that you can do that are recommendations in the book that will turn things around for you. The moral of the story is you have to do something. You have to step in to not be a victim of this kind of neurology pilfering of your consciousness, right? Like we are being mined by the marketing industry. We are being mined by industry, and our lives are just being pilfered. You want your life back? You need your brain back. Pure and simple.
I so agree. And, I think that one of the things that we gain from this further connection to the prefrontal cortex and other areas of the brain, the anterior cingulate, is the ability to experience what is called cognitive empathy, to see things from another person's perspective. And that is so absent from the agora today, the interaction that we see of people that people dig their heels in. It's Republicans v. Democrats, and they're wrong, I'm right, etc. And that's not sustainable. We've got to be able to look at the world from another person's perspective. That's how we move the ball down the field. That embraces diversity of ideology, And as I mentioned earlier, as it related to the gut bacteria, diversity begets resilience. That's how we become more resilient and we make progress. So, as opposed to simply going on those social media sites that continue to fan the flames of our entrenchment in one specific ideology, and at the same time castigate other ideologies. That's not productive. It's not positive, and it just fosters an us versus them mentality. And we need to be done with that. We need to bring the adult back into the room and embrace others' ideas, embrace that we have a beautiful relationship with our planet, and we have to step up to the plate as it relates to that. And I'd say, importantly, it's just time to take a deep breath and be so appreciative of what we have, and avoid the pervasive negativism that is put upon us. The more that negativism is perpetrated upon us, the more it locks us into functioning on a less sophisticated level. So I want to be, at the end of our conversation now, I want to be so positive in where this can go. I'm so hopeful.
Amen. We're talking about resilience. We're talking about life. Life wants to be lived. Life wants to express. Life wants to grow. Life makes you laugh, right? Life has a joy that is an underlying energy underneath it. And when your systems are working correctly and your brain is working correctly, you're just a delightful person to be around. And look, if I want to read a book, I want to read the book of someone who's read all the books and done the work, but then taken 4 months to sit on a boat and listen to the waves. Someone who will take the time and breathe, and someone who will allow for the information to percolate and cook in a soup and come back with a synthesis that has been examined and explored. I don't need more information. I need more wisdom. So thank you for taking the time to sit with it and coming back with wisdom. I really appreciate my conversations with you. And you're always invited back. I love your message and I love what you're doing out there.
Pedram, thank you for that, and I'm so glad that we got a chance to connect and have a couple times now, and I absolutely look forward to our next time together. Thank you again.
Thank you, folks. Dr. Pedram Shojai, The Urban Monk. Go get the book, read it, and don't just read another book. Don't just put another book on your bookshelf and stress about not getting to it. Start reading it, start implementing it. That's when you start feeling better. Pure and simple, right? Take the next step, take the next necessary step. Your brain will start to feel better, and then you can invest that energy into future good deeds, right? For yourself, for the world. It will turn this around one brain at a time. Dr. Perlmutter, thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Talk soon.